Once I just saw the opportunity that was before me, the vision of the media company evolved. And suddenly I thought, man, if I wanted to build a different kind of tech press outlet, I could do that. I actually am one of the few people positioned to do that, maybe alive right now. It doesn't matter if Zuckerberg is like really a bro and like really MAGA. What matters is that he's going to not censor political speech. And that's certainly the commitment. There's certainly an alignment there. We're transitioning away from what feels like a sort of childish ideological war over everything to, at least on the Trump side, Trump's super pragmatic and he just wants things to work and to work with people. So he's all about making deals and making new friends where they used to be enemies.
Hi, welcome. This is the From the New World podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Mike Solana, the Chief Marketing Officer at Founders Fund and the co-founder of Pirate Wires. We discuss building a flagship tech publication, how the vibes have shifted since the start of Pirate Wires, what to expect from the new Trump administration, and how to actually ensure good journalism that isn't ideologically captured. If you like our episode, a great way to help us out is to let a friend know, either in person or online. That way you're not just helping us, but you're helping them find something interesting and informative. Without further ado, here's Mike Solana. So, welcome to the show, Mike Solana.
It's good to be here.
Mark Zuckerberg was doing community notes, changing their content policies. Is he MAGA now?
I just saw an interesting Donald Trump quote about this, that the media, or what's left of what we used to call the sort of the mainstream media, is relentlessly trying to sow discord between the White House and the tech industry, and especially the tech industry that is White House aligned right now. And they brought up the fact that all of these people who are now pretty close to Trump, or most of them, were complicit in the widespread and really terrifying deplatforming of him that happened towards the end of his presidency. I remember writing actually a lot about that myself. I was on the other side of it than where Mark Zuckerberg is now. Mark, obviously, Zuckerberg was complicit in that. I was strongly critical of it, also like frightened of it. That it was crazy to see how much power these people wielded at exactly the same time to silence literally a president. And I struggle with this. I go back and forth on what should be done now that all of that has happened and is over and people have changed their minds. But Trump doesn't seem to be struggling with it. He said, yes, they're different. We're probably all different. And I thought that was an interesting thing. He just is really interested in, I think his perspective is one that I share at this point, which is it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if Zuckerberg is like really a bro and like really MAGA. What matters is that he's going to not censor political speech. And that's certainly the commitment. There's certainly an alignment there. There's this kind of, I'm interested, I don't know if it's right or wrong. We're transitioning away from what feels like a sort of childish ideological war over everything to, at least on the Trump side, Trump's super pragmatic and he just wants things to work and to work with people. So he's all about making deals and making new friends where they used to be enemies. He wasn't very close to Elon either. They danced around each other for a long time and Trump was not happy with him and did not like him and did not trust him. And then that changes and now he's like his best friend or whatever because they have shared goals. And Zuckerberg, as he announced that he was going to be not only was he no longer going to be practicing in any kind of fact checking, and he had there was a whole new system he was putting in place. He also denounced it, and all of the people who were complicit in what was obviously biased, very biased political censorship, not just quote fact checking. But in that statement, he also mentioned this much bigger threat, which is really like the mercantilist approach to trade that you see all over the world, other than America, and the sort of ruthless attacking of our industry that you've seen from Europe, especially over the last handful of years, especially under the Biden administration.
Oh, we're absolutely going to talk about that. And I think your outlet, Pirate Wires, has done some of the best reporting out there on it.
Thanks. Yeah, I think
I just want to focus on this thread here because the big question with Mark and why I think it does matter is it plays into all of the vibe shift. Is it just temporary? Is it just fleeting? Where if
Everything
I
is
don't know, Josh
culture.
Shapiro comes back in 2028, is the censorship machine back on, or have things changed? Are we, really moving to a real era of free speech? That's the question people really care about, right? For the long term and for
Well, I don't
democracy.
know what they expect for some sort of, what do you think a change in culture is? It's not permanent. Clearly, there was a massive culture we just exited that was terrible and clearly temporary. Thank God. Everything is temporary. And what the right wing needs to focus on now is building cultural institutions and some sort of cultural position that's actually attractive rather than reactive, which it had to be under years and years of really scary authoritarianism from the left. The culture will rebuild and it will be different for as long as it will be different. And then, yeah, it will be a change and we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with Mark. My sense watching Mark for years is that Mark's really is returning to a position that he once believed in. All of the guys, you're a little bit younger than me, so significantly younger than me. So I don't know that you remember what it was like in the early Facebook days, and not just early, not like when he was launching it early, but I'm talking 2009, 10, 11, 12 even. Zuckerberg, much like the Twitter guys, were really clinging to free speech and they were being relentlessly attacked for that from the left. Everything got really crazy slowly and then it was very scary in the late teens. It was like, I remember Azealia Banks being deplatformed and that was mid-teens and that seemed, whoa, this is a really big deal. That's crazy. She got, how do you just get kicked off a platform for saying some nasty ethnic slur? But it was like, that was rare at that point. So this feels more to me, the Mark Zuckerberg thing feels more to me like, it really feels like a return. I think it feels like what he wanted it to be. And I hope that it's real and it's long term. And I want to support him for now. Of course, you can't forget the things that he did. You can't forget what happened to Palmer Luckey. You can't forget the
Oh,
people
absolutely.
who agitated for what happened to Palmer Luckey in the press and in the tech industry. I don't forget any of those things. I think most people are really fickle. Most people do not have a really strong sense of right and wrong. Most people are looking around to other people in the culture for cues on what they're supposed to believe. And so I think it's probably just the duty of the rest of us to never be quiet again. If you have a strong conviction, you have to just be really loud about it and be like, no, what you're doing is wrong. And I don't care what you say about me or what you're going to do to me. This is what we should be doing. And I think that's all you can do. And then hope that the culture grasps to that in some way.
Yeah, you mentioned something so important, which is we need to actually go out and build the culture. That's certainly, I think, something that happens at Meta. You have the angel and the devil kind of whispering within the company, whispering on Mark's shoulders. And at least for now, he's chosen the good side. And what you're doing at Pirate Wires, I think it's so important.
Thank you.
When did Pirate Wires start? What year did it start?
I started Pirate Wires in, I think it was like June of 2020, right
So
as
right in the thick of it.
the beginning of it, I would say. It was right when the rioting was happening and people were defending that. Maybe it was,
Yeah,
it
and
would
that's
have been the first week of July, but it was like it was a complete reaction to all of that.
yeah, and by 2020, yeah, it was the time when the censorship machine was set up and it was just picking out like the real targets,
It was getting really bad. That was the, yeah, we were approaching peak. It was like BLM into COVID era restrictions was the worst that it ever was. And so, yeah, that's where we were.
Yeah, you
Right.
couldn't even talk about the lab leak.
No, I couldn't even talk about the lab leak publicly. I did. I wasn't supposed to. I
Yeah.
wasn't supposed to. I remember getting in fights about it, but and even that though, I couldn't. I wasn't saying this definitely came from a lab or obviously came from a lab or looks like it came from a lab. I was like, what if it did? Why would we? It was, you had to ask a lot of questions at that time. You had to always be asking questions. You could never actually say what you thought.
So you're in this environment. People are defending the rioting. It gets difficult even to just say we shouldn't be burning down police stations. And among all of that, you start this brand new outfit. What was that like?
It was all so like instinctive. It didn't even feel like I was doing something. It was like I had a podcast back then that I launched right when the world was closed. I thought I might as well. I had a lot of free time on my hand. I wrapped up final season of Anatomy of Next, which was a show I did for Founders Fund, just in my own home. I produced it. And then concurrently, I was like, I'm going to launch my own show. It was called Problematic. And it was where I covered a lot of these themes. This was around the time that I just launched the idea of Hereticon. We had to shut it down during COVID. But the idea of heretical thought was very much on my mind in 2018, 2019, 2020, before COVID. And I wanted to do stuff on that. So I had the show Problematic. And if I was starting my own media company, which was my ambition, then not just a show, but a company, I was going to need some kind of monetization. The obvious thing for a podcast back then was Patreon, but Patreon was relentlessly deplatforming people who were even vaguely right of center. They were way worse than Twitter or Facebook. And that made me not just, I wasn't just, oh, I don't want to support the censorship platform. It made me nervous. I thought I could easily have everything turned off and lose a major source of revenue over at Patreon. So what else can I do? And my friends told me about Substack. And Substack, no one was on Substack at that point. There were some people, but it was not a huge thing. I don't even know that Matt Taibbi was there yet. Certainly Barry Weiss was not on Substack yet. This was new and exciting. And I thought, well, I don't have a newsletter, but they have some podcasting features. And most importantly of all, I imagined that I would use it the way that Patreon was used, which was like, you're just doing this because you're a fan of the show and you want to help out. And so I want to just give someone a way to pay me, not force them to pay me, but if you want to pay me, like here's the button that you click. So I set up a Substack, and I thought to sweeten the deal for my people who are going to listen to my podcast, I would offer them a newsletter as well, like a fun. I was like, fuck it, I'll just write about what's going on that week and cover just like the headlines, but in my voice, and just have fun with it. And I needed a name, and Pirate Wires just literally popped into my head and felt exactly right immediately. I didn't
Great name.
thought into it as well. It was almost as if I was remembering it. Is truly what it felt like. And all my best favorite titles for things, and I title a lot of things. I have a million projects, so it's like podcasts I've created and every essay that I write, books that I've written. It's like the best names for me are the names that just feel like I'm remembering the names. And that just came to me, and I thought it once, that's definitely the name for what I'm doing. And then I wrote my first newsletter, and it did better than my podcast. And the next one did even better, and the next one did even better. And at that point, by like issue 3, I started thinking, man, people are actually, I didn't think anyone was going to read this, but a bunch of people are reading this. So, man, I really gotta do a better job writing it. I have to take it more seriously. I want to make sure that it's really good. I want to make sure every sentence is like tight and funny and excellent. And it gradually, just over the course of a few months, morphed from me talking about everything that was going on that week to essays. Like maybe I started with 3 chunky ones, and then it became 2, and then eventually it became 1, where it was like 3 short things to 2 bigger things to 1 huge thing. And that was the genesis of Pirate Wires. And all along that process, as I worked harder and harder at it, it just got way more popular. And for me back then to have, in the very earliest days, like 1,000 people read a piece, I'd be like, whoa, 1,000 people, that's a lot of fucking people who are reading my essay. And to have 1,000 subscribers seemed like really a lot. And I felt suddenly compelled to, not even compelled, I just really wanted to live. I wanted to produce something really great for all these people who were supporting me and also giving me money randomly. And I thought, man, I better do a good job at this. And so I just started to take it really seriously and care a lot about it. And I wanted to have really good essays on really good things. And it became really exciting and was really fun. And those first 2 years of Pirate Wires were probably the most rewarding creative experience of my life, I would say. I felt like I was doing work that no one else was doing, and I was writing in a way that no one else was writing. And I felt that it really mattered because no one else was doing it. And people would connect with me, and they would write back to me, and they would share stories with me. And it was really a beautiful process, and I'm very grateful for it.
You set out to start a media company. Fast forward to today, Pirate Wires has editors, is interviewing Palmer Luckey, has all sorts of contributors, as a whole ecosystem. When you started, were you just thinking, I'm just going to start a newsletter, just starting a podcast? Or did you envision the Pirate Wires of today?
When I started, I envisioned a bunch of podcasts. I thought I was going to do one podcast that would be popular, and then I would do more podcast. I would raise money, or not, I would get money from that podcast, and I would produce more podcasts. I had a series of podcast ideas that I was going to do, all different sort of high theme shows, and some would be even semi fictional. And I was all these ideas that I was always jotting down in notebooks. And then once the newsletter took off, way bigger than the podcast ever did, I was always a writer. My earliest ambition was to write. All throughout my 20s, I was writing. I've written books. I just didn't have much of an essay for any or much of an audience for my writing when I was younger. Like I always wrote. It's just people weren't reading what I was saying. And at that moment, what I realized at that moment in 2020 was I had actually built a pretty big audience on Twitter. So there was an audience that was interested in what I had to say. There was just a question of whether or not they would be interested in my longer form stuff that I didn't even ask because I didn't even care. And I learned that they were, that actually not only were they interested in reading what I had to write long form, they were interested in paying for it. And then I suddenly realized that I had a product and could do a lot more. And I love to write, always have. Do I love the process of writing? I love having written. I'm compulsed to write. I write. I cannot stop writing.
You love
And
waking
so,
up after a day's dream, seeing an entire manuscript in front of you. Where did that
yeah,
come from?
once I just saw the opportunity that was before me, the vision of the media company evolved. And suddenly I thought, man, if I wanted to build a different kind of tech press outlet, I could do that. I actually am one of the few people positioned to do that, maybe alive right now. And there's a question of whether or not that's lucrative, or there was then, but certainly I was able to do it. And like very few people would have been able to do it because very few people would have, there weren't many other writers like me in the first place. And there weren't many other people. Like I was a writer of a certain kind. I had a lot of information on and context about what was happening in the tech industry, and I had access to funding. So it was like, I have to do this. I just have to do it or I'll regret it for the rest of my life. And so I did it. And that changed everything for me. Once I raised money and built a team, and we're just about profitable now, and I've got a team of 7 or just about 8, that put me in a different I was no longer able to just be creative, fun-loving guy online writing essays whenever I want. It was like now there's a business model. I have multiple people I have to manage. We have to think about products, and it becomes a different thing. I still, there's a lot of the creativity still there. It's just I have to do that plus a lot of other stuff.
Is there anything you really want to write about but can't?
Yeah, it's not like can't, it just won't. There's stuff that I really want to write about in culture. I would love to write about. I have all sorts of opinions about television, for example, and movies and music, but it's just not what my audience is even remotely interested in. And so it's I save those thoughts for my friends and I write about what I write about, which is a pretty broad I gave myself the intersection of technology, politics, and culture because it was broad and weirdly no one was in it. And my specific interest is how they all relate. And like strangely, there are not many people, or there weren't then in 2020, who were very keyed into the specific way that tech was impacting these other things and how that in turn was impacting tech. And so that's what I'm really excited about. And I try and stick to that professionally. I'll go out though. I'll expand. I'm down to do more fiction in the future. I have a book that I wrote that no one read because I didn't have an audience back when I published it 10 years ago, more. Oh, wow. What much more, like 14 years ago when I published it. So I've got that. I've got a sequel to it that has never been published. I could find an editor or an agent this time. I didn't do that last time, probably easily because I have so many followers. It just is going to take time. So the question is always now, do I have enough time to do this or that? And you're always making sacrifices for another. But I would like to do that. I would like Citizen Sim to find an audience, which I think would be huge now.
Yeah, the alternate universe where maybe in a few years, maybe not alternate, where you're just printing best-selling novels. What's the most underrated novel to you?
The most underrated novel. One thing that's crazy is how many people are reading ANTM right now. There is no anti-memetics division. So I would not say that's underrated. I would have said that until I noticed a few months ago it became a meme. Now everybody's buying it, talking about it.
Oh,
Um,
how ironic.
but I read that many years ago. I think a few years ago at this point. when no one had ever heard of it. I think I tweeted about it. I got Palmer Lucky to read it. He loves it. So now I think it was underrated. Now it's properly rated. I don't know about under. Yeah, I think the books that I've read they're all pretty much rated correctly. Like I read great books, and people tend to agree they're great books. Like there are people who don't like this or that book, but no one would ever say that Hemingway's not a great novelist. I guess there are people who say Ayn Rand sucks, but also there are just as many people who say she's amazing. So I don't know that I have a recommendation for you there.
Yeah, no worries. So one of the themes of this show, I think, is we talked about how Mark Zuckerberg, he's just responding to the vibe shift. But there are people who led it. I think you're one of the people who led it. And one of the themes of the show is really honoring the people who led it and pointing out there are people in the past, in the very recent past, who contributed to what we have now. Who is someone who you would give the award to, of someone who contributed to the vibe shift?
There's only one person, and his name is Peter Thiel. And it's like very apparent that I would give myself I don't like to give you don't want to give yourself credit for anything, but not only
I'll give you the credit for it.
like on the vibe shift thing, I used the phrase vibe shift specifically as it related to tech, I think before anybody else. The vibe shift, there was a vibe shift piece a while ago that had nothing to do with the way that we talk about the vibe shift today. The vibe shift, in the sense that we are speaking today, rise of the oligarchy within the tech industry and things like that, I was writing about that. That was my idea, and I was writing about that. But whatever, I sound like a crazy person. Maybe every writer wants to lay some kind of claim to that. The thing is, the person who empowered me to write, and the person who empowered so many of the people now part of all of this, is Peter. Peter was the first person who ever. Peter was the first person who didn't. Not only was he not, did he not care about all the thoughts that I had that no one was supposed to, hear. He only cared about those. He really encouraged me at a time when I was very young and didn't know what I was or what my potential was, and was relentlessly told that my thoughts were bad and my ideas were bad and I was bad. Like that's what you were getting back then in your early 20s and in the late 2000s, which is when I met Peter. And he gave me encouragement. He gave me a job. He gave me mentorship, and he's not like a big like you did a great job kind of guy. Um, but I wouldn't have anything without him. I wouldn't have any of this without him. And there are a lot of people who are like that, who are in that category. Like when you go through all of the people out there, it's him. And then when you go to just the world of pure ideas, nobody was fucking talking about the woke culture before Peter. I did an interview with him, which was all about his book, The Diversity Myth. And it's just straight away. He's a decade ahead of everything that's going on. He was the one. It's crazy to watch everybody jumping over themselves to claim some kind of responsibility for the Trump election today in tech. When Peter was run out of San Francisco for being the only person willing to do it in 2016, yeah, my award goes to him. All of my laurels go to Mr. Thiel.
Oh, absolutely. And you're dead right about 2016. 2016 was the one that caught everyone off guard.
Yeah.
Everything that came after, that was,
Yeah.
as you mentioned earlier, I'm a bit younger, a lot younger. I hear about seasteading as where all of this began. Is that
Well,
true?
that's where it began for me. That's how I met Peter. Is that what you meant? Or what?
Yeah, yeah, but I hear from other people too. But
Well, seasteading was one of many things that were going on at that time that were very interesting and contrarian and controversial. And Peter was a part of all of them, if not funding them all. There was like all the early AI stuff was happening back then, like the singularity type people were doing stuff back then. And there was major tech trends that Peter was funding. And in the idea space, seasteading was an anarchist project. So we're talking hardcore libertarians who don't really exist anymore. Like the way that libertarianism existed back then is not really, it's no longer, it felt ascendant then. And I was excited about it. And I considered myself an anarcho-capitalist. Seasteading was this project that Peter had funded. It was a nonprofit, and they wanted to facilitate the building of a bunch of autonomous cities in the middle of the ocean This idea being the ocean, these are international waters, and you could build whatever you wanted out there. You could build a whole ocean of tiny little micronations. And they would all have their own governments, and some would be monarchies, and some would be communist utopias, and some would be fascist dictatorships, and some would be democracies, probably not. And they would all compete with each other in the open market. And we would learn a lot about government, and we would also be free. And that was really inspiring to me as a very young person. And I met Peter through that myself. But I would say probably few people benefited from that as much as me. Maybe I benefited the most from that, because that is where I don't know anyone who I got a job out of that. Like, I got a job with Peter out of that. And that just
Very
altered.
enviable thing.
It altered. Back then it wasn't. Back then it was in tech, but I wasn't in tech. I was in publishing, and I didn't nobody that I knew who Peter Thiel was. Nobody. I was doing this because I believed in the idea of it, and I met Peter because of this specific idea that he had funded. And I thought he was just the coolest person ever on paper before I met him, because of that. And also just I learned about through reading about, it was an essay of his called The Education of a Libertarian. I learned about things like the tech industry, and I knew about tech but not the industry. I had no sense whatsoever about how that functioned, or Silicon Valley. I love saying this, but it's true. I did not know if it was a real place or not. I thought it might be like a metaphor or something. And like it
Yeah.
just, I had no clue. And I did like the idea of seasetting though. And I reached out to them. I volunteered. I was going to write for them. I threw meetup groups for them. And I met Peter through that. I think certainly that's where all of today's, we talk about charter cities today, all of that comes out of the seasteading movement. But the seasteading movement, like, it's really a place for people to talk about crazy fringe ideas that are related specifically to governance, I would say. There are other things that were happening like that I was not a part of, that had more to do, like the EA stuff. And there was, like, I feel like in the early days of that, it was not so like insidious. It was really optimistic and exciting as well. I was vaguely aware of it back then. It wasn't my stuff, but I thought it was cool. And you had, yeah, like the early discussions of AI stuff, and all the Mars stuff was happening. And yeah, it was fun. There were a lot of new ideas. There were not a lot of new ideas. I didn't realize it at the time, how exciting that was and how rare that was. But it was this kind of, there was this bubbling up, this sort of, because these are the Ron Paul days still. So there was this very interesting heterodox political renaissance. I don't know if it's a renaissance, but movement happening, a movement of ideas, of people challenging old ideas and being really comfortable with new crazy ideas. And in fact, like, really loving them. All this was happening behind enemy lines, in like fairly hostile cultural territory in New York City,
Yeah, in deep blue California.
in New York City. I was in New York City at the time, and it was small, but that's where I was encountering this stuff.
So you mentioned something that I also noticed, that libertarianism, it's stale now. How did that happen? What happened to it?
By denying God, this is such a huge topic, and I don't want to insult anybody, because I have a lot of respect for there are a handful of libertarians who are still going strong. And what I like about it is it's super principled, it's super rational, and there's a really strong foundation of literature that these people are standing on top of, that is really good. But for libertarianism to work, to me, it seems like the entire world has to be libertarian. It doesn't work if you're doing parts of it and not others. It doesn't work even in your own country if you're going to be libertarian on one issue, like, for example, open borders, but fail at being libertarian on something like a welfare state, right? If you get only some libertarianism, actually the outcomes are far worse. And so for my own personal pathway out was really that. It was just like, this is stupid. I'm just much more pragmatic than this. This is not working. And you can't have open borders plus a welfare state. And you're never going to get rid of the welfare state. So you can't have open borders, period. Done. It's over. Like, the conversation should end. I think that libertarians don't have really good answers for things like immigration, out of control immigration. They don't have really good answers for things like crime. They don't have really good answers even for, I would say, like, a lot of the disorder and social decay that we've seen recently. There's almost like a fundamentalist There's a fundamentalism about libertarianism when it comes to the marketplace that a free market will solve everything. That doesn't work in the context of free trade. Also, for example, you can't be the only person who believes in free trade in a world where no one believes in free trade. And so it's like that fundamentalism, I think, blinded people to practical solutions. And we left the world of ideology by really the mid 20 teens. Donald Trump forward, from Donald Trump forward, nobody was interested in ideological anything anymore because the world was just very obviously everyone came to agreement on the problems we were facing on the left and right. People generally agreed that things were fucked. And in those moments, until things get, I think even when things get really bad, what motivates people are solutions to those problems. So it's let's do something. Who is going to do something about the crime? Who is going to do something about inflation? Who is going to do something about the border and trade and things like that and housing? And that is just a messier question. And I think culture followed the cultural figurehead in some sense, and that was Trump. And I think Trump really killed libertarianism because libertarianism got a lot out of being the young, cool kids version of right wing stuff. And suddenly there was this ascendant counter mainstream conservative movement in Trump that was actually winning. And we had never seen that in our lifetimes. People saw it under Reagan. I don't have any recollection of that. I wasn't even born when Reagan was running. So it's for most of us, that was the first time we ever believed that's, wait a minute, the Death Star could actually be defeated. Is that true? And that began, I think, an ideological shift that began the ideological shift that people became curious about this and started challenging. I certainly started challenging it after Trump won. A couple of years into that, I was challenging my own thoughts on trade and immigration and like how I wasn't really challenging my thoughts on law and order. I was allowing myself to think about stuff I'd always suppressed for ideological reasons under libertarianism. And so began something new. I think the libertarians' biggest problem is really the perception of loser. Like it's just they've always lost.
Oh,
They've,
oh,
they've
absolutely. Yeah,
never won
this was the thing. There was a feeling, especially under COVID. There was always the question. This was like a bet that people had before COVID. If institutions of society suddenly like really started cracking down in like a genuinely authoritarian way, are people going to flee to libertarianism or are they going to flee to something else? And the answer, I think there's no doubt about it now, was something else.
Yeah.
Because the idea was you had all these people. First, you had people locking you down, and this was not something that libertarianism actually successfully defended against pretty much anywhere. And then you had people trying to defund the police. You had people trying to stop the police from just keeping your neighborhood safe.
I mean, you
And
had
that was the
libertarians
next
defund
thing.
the police. There were plenty of libertarians who wanted to fund the police, at least back then. A real libertarian is completely on the side of the victims of police, not of.
Yeah, yeah, we have the private police.
Yes, and that just it just is obvious it's not what anyone wants. I think there's a problem of vision as well. Libertarianism is really critically about the absence of vision. The idea is that the market will be open and people will be free and things will beautiful things, important, incredible things will be naturally emergent. When left to their own devices, people will create a well-ordered, like beautiful, robust, growing society or something. And you can just table for a moment whether or not that's even true and just talk about what motivates people. And what motivates people is a vision. And the only Republicans were contra vision completely. They were like, defund the government. Democrats were like, we have a vision. It's crazy, but we all know everyone had a sense of what the vision was. And libertarians were against like the concept of a vision. So what happens over time is just the left wins and wins and wins because you can't defeat the average person's conception of government is the government should be doing something. It should be creating something. And you can argue about whether or not they should have that vision. The reality is they do have that vision. That is like an innate desire of people, is for the people in charge to be doing shit. And if you don't have a vision for that, you're going to lose. And libertarians are losers. Sorry, love you, but losers.
Yeah, you're seeing this fight happen now with H-1B visas. You're seeing H-1Bs, they do have a vision. One certainly has a vision. And you can say, is Tesla or is SpaceX, XAI, are those companies representative of H1Bs in general? Maybe not. But Elon definitely has a vision. And this is something that's attention in the right.
Yeah. I think that the vision of Elon is certainly why he's the guy in tech right now and has been for years, since Steve Jobs, really, who also had a vision for tech. And you can see Steve Jobs' vision less now because it's been so long since he died. But before he died, it's again something that younger people will not have any recollection of. But I came into tech and Steve Jobs was still alive. And that's all anyone, he is the only person that anyone talked about. He was huge and almost suffocating in a way. People loved him and worshiped him, and he was the king unofficially. And so, really, what happened is they copied him. And you saw his design, his sort of like aesthetic impulses, you saw them in every single product that existed. You can go back and look at something like Square, the cleanness of Square. And Jack Dorsey's he has brilliant design instincts and they're beautiful. And he really cares a lot about design. And in Twitter a bit, but really in Square, I think you see those expressed. You can draw a direct line from Apple. It is like Steve Jobs was the artist that inspired all of that. And it's just because he was the guy. He was the guy that who everyone wanted to be. They wanted to be as good as him. They wanted to be like him. They wanted to be talked about like him. They wanted the bios to be written about like him. And when he died, I remember there was an article that actually was like, and it made the rounds at the time. It was who's going to be the next Steve Jobs. And it was just a list of all these different tech people. One of them was Elizabeth Holmes from Theranos, which
Perfect. She has the turtleneck.
she had the turtleneck.
Yeah.
And one was Elon Musk. And I remember even thinking at the time, like, well, it's obviously going to be Elon, right? It has to be. He's the guy who's doing spaceships. That's so cool. But I was an outlier. I worked at Founders Fund. Founders Fund has been super involved in that from the earliest days. Not everyone else was. Founders Fund was made fun of when we invested in SpaceX by institutional investors who I will not name. People would stand up in front of their LPs and say, well, we're never going to be investing in rocket ships, LOL. And it's okay. That was I guess it was rational back then in a way. It seemed crazy. It wasn't what we did in tech. We did software was what was dominating and the thing that we did and built, and maybe some hardware, but even that no one cared about back then. It was that people were focused on software, doing different things and apps. And Elon was like, I'm going to privatize the space industry. That's a crazy goal. And he wasn't doing it when I joined Founders Fund. He had the company, but it was not the rocket ships were not, first of all, they were not reusable at that point, but I don't even know that they had successfully launched a rocket at that point when I first joined. It was coming. We all wanted it to come. It was really exciting. And by we at Founders Fund, broadly in tech, he was not worshipped the way obviously that he is now. A few years later, he was. Well, once he started landing, just successfully launching rockets, he was the guy. And I think people follow him in that way. They follow people who are able to win and do things and make you proud to be associated with the industry. And I think that will be the same for politics as well. There is the comparison there with Trump. It's like he makes people proud on the right because he's winning. And that's really powerful. Maybe that's like the only thing you need is the perception of victory.
Yeah, and with rockets, it's such a special case because if the rocket blows up, everyone will know.
Yeah.
But also, if you catch it, everyone will know. It's the same either way, and I think that's something where Elon can really shine.
Yeah, he just is unambiguously successful at doing things that were supposed to be impossible. So I've had a riff on this a while ago that I started and still believe, which is less so now that he's considered a villain by so many people, it's a little bit different. But a few years ago, before he bought Twitter, he was much quieter about his political opinions and he was more universally loved, except there was always a flood of people who were mad at him just for being rich. And back then, the discourse was here's this guy doing this cool thing. And then some idiot journalist or politician like Bernie Sanders would say, we should be privatizing that thing and all those billions should be going to the poor or something. And why isn't he spending his money on solving world hunger was the thing that came up again and again. And it really bothered me until I realized why that was happening. It wasn't that they were saying, it wasn't even so much, I think, about resentment. It was more Elon Musk was the only example of a human being in the country actually doing something difficult successfully that they had. They didn't have the reason they weren't asking their government to solve hunger in America was because their government couldn't do it, obviously. Their government was failing at everything. So when they would ask for help on things that should be government's responsibility, for example, um, uh, the big one would have been like healthcare or something, right? Like that muddled healthcare catastrophe that was created by politicians, I think on purpose, but that's a different conversation. Um, you say, Elon, why aren't you helping people like cure like why aren't you solving healthcare? Why aren't you curing cancer or whatever? What they're really saying is, can you please do this? I know that you have it. I've seen evidence that you can do hard things. Can you please do this? And if you read it that way, it became almost sweet rather than annoying. Wow, they just they're like these peasants praying to a god to help them. It's what actually is happening.
I think really look on the bright side when it comes to journalists. I there's something there, but I almost think it's the opposite thing, where you know Elon just is a hero, and I think that there's a certain type of person who is very terrified of the idea that we will have heroes. That anyone who is perceived as a hero, especially by a lot of people, that's inherently dangerous. That's democracy dying. And what I think we really saw, you saw this with Steve Jobs as well. And it's so hard to disentangle. Is it that billionaires specifically are the kind of people that they dislike, or is it that they've just successfully gotten rid of every other type of hero, right? I think that you'll see this. We don't have the same kind of mythology around athletes that we had around astronauts, to some degree, even with scientists, with Oppenheimer. And this concept of heroism really faded away, really became a kind of like fairy tale, something that you would only see in like a Marvel movie, and couldn't possibly be in real life. And there's this chicken and egg problem, right? Are they angry at Elon because he's the only last example of heroes left? Or is Elon the only example of heroes left because they were more angry at all of the other alternatives?
You're asking me, hmm,
Yeah, like this reaction to Elon, I think on one hand you can think of it as hoping that he'll do something, but there's been times in the past where it wasn't just billionaires who were venerated in that way. I guess the thing that I'm asking really is, why did that die? Why did that end?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't think anyone is going to have an answer for sure. I know that I agree with you that it happened, and heroes are not only are they not supposed to exist, it's the concept of a hero makes people angry. The concept of some people being better than others makes people really angry. I think that's always been the case. And historically, over a really long period of time, I think that's generally been the case. And actually, the aberration was in America, where there was some bit of like excitement over the thought of what you could become. Because here, there was a sense that, well, anyone could become that. And then also, though, I've looked back at history surrounding like the Gilded Age and things like this, and there was a lot of anger towards our richest and most ambitious and most creative people back then as well. So I wonder, I go back and forth on this. I certainly know I agree that the hero thing has really died culturally, but maybe it was never so great as we think. We remember some of them, but that there's always been quite a bit of populist outrage about people who are perceived as better than them. I think probably a lot of this has to do with general insecurity and jealousy. And I don't have those things. And I don't know, I was raised by a mom who just told me that I was perfect and awesome and was going to do great things. And that probably has been really good for
And
my
all of that came true.
she also told me money didn't matter and who cared what other people had. It doesn't matter what other people think. And these were the things that I learned and I really just believed. And I've never been personally swayed by those things, which has maybe it's left me open to hero worship, which worship maybe is the wrong word, but adoration. I have heroes. I agree that I don't know if we need, it's so hard to prescribe this for other people. I don't want to be telling people what they need to do and have in their life. I know that the heroes that I've found in my life have been these stars in the it's like in a constellation that's been my compass. And that's been very helpful for me to have. Yeah, I do wish that we had more of an openness to heroes in this world and like ticker tape parades for Elon rather than mass calls to have him extradited to the UK and put in prison. But yeah, I don't know how to get us there other than culture, which I'm trying my best.
Yeah, what's going on in the EU is crazy. To go full circle,
Yeah, there's
there
this
are a
good.
lot of great things that Mark Zuckerberg announced. I think they're all good. The thing that really caught my eye was that I forget the exact quote, but basically that he was going to work with Trump to push back on the EU censorship. That was something that I think was just so important because, like right now, like you said, the EU is still going after Elon on his interview on X with the leader of the AFD. Literally just an interview, and Europe, at least right now, Europe seems to still be going in the same direction. They haven't gotten the vibe shift.
That's a whole other. I don't really understand Europe at all. I see horrible things coming out of there. Like I'm
Horrible things coming out of the EU.
yeah, yeah, again, it's like it's
Coming
just
out of Brussels, they're sending their laws from Brussels to California.
yeah, but
They're
California.
not sending their best.
I don't. I actually, and maybe probably a bunch of right wing people would really disagree with me, but I don't believe that in California people would tolerate Pakistani rape gangs roaming the streets. I really don't. I think that my experience in San Francisco is the exact opposite. We didn't even have Pakistani rape gangs. We have a really bad bunch of politicians who didn't do a lot on things like crime. And guess what? They all started getting voted out. There was a huge reaction against them, and things are changing slowly, too slowly for my liking, but they're not tolerating this kind of thing. Americans are very different than, especially the British. I think the British have been beaten down culturally for so long that you're really dealing with people who have internalized a sense that they should be losing. And in America, for a long time, whereas in America, what you have are people grappling with the question of whether or not they're still winning and frustrated if they're not winning enough. But if you just look at the numbers, I mean, we're winning way more than they're winning in Europe. And I think Americans are just more optimistic and demand more from their own lives. Even on the left, there is a lot of ambition and a lot of, I want to have a great life and my life should be awesome. Whereas in the UK, I really don't think they believe that. So their tolerance for horrible things is much higher. For gnarly, anti-human things is much higher. In fact, they expect it on some level. And and I think that extends beyond the rape gangs to their speech laws and their immigration policies, which are suicidal, and certainly their birth rates, which are ours are bad, theirs are worse. And yeah, that's what I've got.
Yeah, like this is something when I found this out, I was just shocked that like the entire European political class are heirs. Of course, there are exceptions, and there are exceptions the other way. We have the Clintons, we have the Romneys. There are political dynasties in the U.S. The Kennedys, they're back in the news, but a lot of politicians did not have a background in politics, especially on the level of Congress. And the EU is just almost every single one of them. And the entrepreneurs, they're all heirs in the EU. It's just all inherited. It's not people creating things. It's just decline everywhere. And yeah, I think we're learning what that does to a country and what that does to a people. The big question people have is, can the US reverse that? Can Trump, can Mark Zuckerberg, can we fix them?
Yeah, I've always been on the side of we can, and I've been accused of being naive and being wrong. And a lot of this comes in the way that I've talked about San Francisco. There are some people, you don't have to get into who really are all about the sort of exit path and who now also are concurrently arguing about what should be done in these places, which is you got to pick a lane. Are you exit or are you built? Pick a lane. I think that we just have to fight and we have to win and we have to build because if we don't, it's the end of Western civilization. I think it actually is. I think those really are the stakes. I think that Europe's very clearly incapable of doing anything. I think they do look to us, though, for cues on how to exist. And I think a massive cultural change here that is successful and will inspire people like us abroad And I do believe that places like France specifically, maybe less so the UK, but I think France, I have a lot of hope for France. I think France can be saved. And I hope that France saves itself. It's like we still owe them for the existence of our country. So I'm rooting for them from afar. And I do believe that things will get better here. I think believe things are already getting better here. I think it starts with culture, and the culture is completely opened up to the idea that we can do things and change things and grow things. Like Greenland, for example, is inspiring. Yeah, it's inspiring tons of articles attacking the idea or whatever, but it's not suppressing it's not suppressing the conversation. Those articles used to stem up, and you hear there'd be one wave of articles saying Donald Trump threatened to invade a place. It's just like Hitler, and that would be the end of the idea. In fact, that's what happened last time. That's not happening this time because the media no longer controls the culture. The culture is wild for better and for worse. And in that wild west sort of media environment, strong ideas just grow. And I think there will be really bad ideas, and we're going to have a problem moving forward with probably a series of really dangerous ideas. But right now, like some of the ideas, at least some of the ideas I see in play, which would have been suppressed, are not being suppressed, and I'm excited and hopeful about that.
What's the worst idea and what's the best idea?
I think the best idea is the idea that we're great and should be great and should act great and should grow. Like they're all related. It's like this idea of like American dominance and greatness. This like raw I wrote this piece called The Revolution of the Proletariat. And I think that idea is really powerful and really good. It is this idea that you are allowed, not even allowed, but should just be proud of yourself and proud enough of yourself to want more of yourself, to want to populate the world with people like you, to want to grow the territory of the world that acts like you, to just protect and defend what you have because it's good and great and you're great. Like that stuff is really good. And I think really empowering, and it's really working. And I think really invigorating. It's like this shot of testosterone to the ass, and it has just jolted people into this new, men specifically, into this new confidence that allows you to just say no to really crazy things like, but shouldn't crime be legal? And you're just like, we're not doing that anymore. And that's like the very low hanging fruit, where the Overton window is now so expanded because of the greatness. I mean, we're talking about acquiring Greenland. Okay. No one's tolerating people stealing from a drugstore anymore. That's just not even on the table. And so that shift in the bounds of what is acceptable speech is really important. So you can get the common sense stuff at least off the table. Now, the worst idea, so hard because there are so many, but I think probably the worst idea would be the same idea that's been really bad for what, a century at this point, which is, I don't want to call it communism because I think communism is a manifestation of the bad idea. It's this idea that you don't have a lot because other people have more. And if you take what other people have, that will be fair. And I don't know what to really call that idea.
Envy?
The what?
Envy?
Yeah, but it's more than envy. It's the practicum of, or I'm sorry, it's the praxis of envy in a way. It's communism is the most popular version of that, but you see it all over the place. And I see it on the right and the left. Obviously, the left, it manifests as communism constantly. It never stops. But on the right, you see it manifest among the MAGA people. You saw that during the Luigi Mangione thing with insurance. You see it again right now in the case of the fires in Los Angeles. There was a guy who commented about, he asked if there were any private firefighters, whatever, to help his home, which was going to burn down. It has since burned down. And there were no fire. It's like we're talking about a world where the city is not saving you. You're alone. And he's asking, does anybody know anyone who I can pay to help me save myself? Because the city cannot save me, won't save me, declining to save me, the city who I pay money to. The state has failed. Now I need help. He's desperate. And he was relentlessly attacked by, I noticed, sure, yeah, a lot of hammer and, what is it? Hammer and
Hammer
sickle.
and sickle folks?
But, well, yeah, of course, those guys were there in legion, but so were MAGA people. they are aligned on this issue. The far on the sort of far, I don't even want to call it far. It's one polarity of MAGA is very populist and very anti-elitist, and you see that manifest here as a hatred of people like that. In fact, one of the most viral tweets, I see you shaking your head that you don't know. One of the most viral tweets that I quoted was a woman who has in her bio, it's like a MAGA Trump thing.
Oh, I think
Um,
I saw that tweet. I did not know that was like a Trump person. I thought that was just your garden variety communist.
Yep. No, they have a lot of alignment, and
Okay.
it really
Damn.
is rooted in a hatred of the elite. And I don't have a hatred of the conceptual elite. I have a hatred of our elite, or at least the elite that existed during COVID. That's the elite that I hated. I think that a society with no hierarchy is no social hierarchy, no economic, maybe economic, I don't really care about, but no, without like political hierarchy. And sure, opt in. Let's have representatives and things like this, but you need hierarchy. You need hierarchy in leadership. You need hierarchy in society, I believe. And I think these things are naturally just emergent because that is how people are hardwired. And when you try and subvert that and say, no, we're all equal, everyone is the same, everyone's voice is the same, everyone's or just as valuable, everyone should have the same, that is just that's fucked up and stupid and leads to the cannibalism of your entire society. And of course, we want people to have equal access to something like fire support. But guess what? No one had it in the Palisades. So,
Yeah, there's always this. It goes back to heroes. I think we need heroes and we need to admire heroes. And there's a version of this, I think. There's a version of this even on the right that's there are followers and leaders, and then the followers need leaders. And sure, there are differences between people, but I think a lot of people who we would now consider great had people they looked up to, had mentors, had people that they followed, had people who helped them, and had so it's not just that you're always a leader or you're always a follower. Even the future leaders need leaders of today, and that's something that just compared to history feels so taken away from people.
mm. Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. And I think that one of the most insidious aspects of the leftist authoritarian thing that happened throughout the late teens and early 2020s was the targeted assassination of our heroes in myth. They specifically went after our American sort of collective heroes, the founding fathers, and even as far as in San Francisco, they're tearing down the statues of people like Ulysses S. Grant. They're renaming buildings that were named after Abraham Lincoln. So you're going now into the Civil War. People on the right side of the Civil War, I shouldn't use air quotes, it was the right side, but people on the right side of the Civil War were also demonized. And then it extends into the 20th century, obviously, and it's no one is safe. Anyone who wrote a book and said one wrong word, it's like now it's their entire canon is taken out. And that was very much what the strategy was, I think. It was, I do think, a dedicated strategy of destroying our cultural heroes. And you do that to both, I think, demoralize a people. That's what this tearing down of the statues is. It exists for a reason. You see this in every culture that's been taken over by another, specifically this destruction of the heroes, the prior order. And then the renaming of things, the attempt to put a new crop of heroes in place. And they were all these sort of social justice-y type icons. None of those seem to have taken. And now they've very much all been rejected, like a body rejecting a bad organ or something. And now we're in a kind of, again, the Wild West. And it's very unclear where our culture is going to go from here. But I think that the left really succeeded. I should say, like the sort of virulently authoritarian left really succeeded in permanently ending our reverence for the past. It's really, I think, more dangerous than people realize.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say how destructive this is. I just can't agree with you enough. When you do this to the historical canon, especially the popular historical canon, I think on an academic level it can be recovered, but what Leo Strauss would say is that it is the destruction of natural right. It's the destruction of these things that reappear time and time again in human nature that we remember because they represent something that recurs and that matters. And all of this He was writing this even well before this. He was talking about the academic tradition, but I think it's all one continuous thing. Is the destruction for kind of presentism, right? For judging everything by the standards of the present and focusing so much on that it's all just vibes. There's nothing permanent. It's all just what is the current mood? What is the mood of the current crop of university students? Everything is subservient to that. And I think that we can only know how destructive that was to our society in the past. We can only look at it accurately once
Right.
it's behind us.
Which is one of the things that is very frightening about this current moment that we're in. It's and why I'm reluctant to say that things have really changed. Because if everything is just subservient now to the vibe of the moment, then we're talking right now about the vibe shift. What that
Yes.
implies to me is not some kind of rebirth of what we once were or the foundation we once had, but just the vibe has changed. And we're so unmoored that it changed rapidly and culture aligned itself around it rapidly. And now we're in just in a different place, but that could change in a month. And we've really lost our grounding. I wrote a pair of pieces years ago, right before I started Pirate Wires. It was a pair of essays called, or maybe it was after I started Pirate Wires. I wasn't, everything was not just like an issue of Pirate Wires. I would do, in the early days, I would do, oh, now I'm going to do a really ambitious essay that's separate. And I like one about aliens back before those were a thing, or UFOs rather. And then one was called Tether. And it was about this idea that the internet is a malleable place. We had this idea when we were much younger that, at least I did, again, when I was coming online in the early 2000s, not everybody was online yet. And in those early days of the internet, there was a sense that the internet was this permanent record of everything. And now, no matter what you did, you should always be careful what you do on the internet because it will be remembered forever, is what our parents would say. Anything that you do online, you'll never be able to erase. And what we've seen years later, decades later, is that the something like the opposite is true. The
Yes,
internet is
absolutely, absolutely.
far less permanent than the analog world, and it is super malleable, super changeable. That would be a problem in and of itself, just because we are so focused on the internet that it might as well be the only source of information that we have. And people, if we had some other permanent record, people wouldn't even check it. They would just look at the internet. Whatever the internet says goes. But it's much more dangerous because the last, I think, Encyclopedia Britannica was like 2010, I think. We don't store information that way anymore. A lot of the information that has to do with our world only happens on the internet, and we have entire sites going down, and with them entire encyclopedias of knowledge just erased. There are all of these cultural movements and moments that happened exclusively online in the 2010s. All of millennial culture, like this huge aspect of millennial culture, was what happened on the internet from like 2005 to 2015, and a lot of that stuff's just erased. Like we couldn't even retrace it if we wanted to. That, and I guess the subject of my piece back then was what that feels is we've snapped the tether that is tying us back to the real world, and we're just adrift now. And that's where I feel increasingly we are, like a people that really thinks a lot of stuff but has no record of the path in thinking that led them to where they currently are.
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of that. What's really interesting about that is that I think it almost predates the internet. That there's the literal thing of can we find that blog from 10 years ago? I think that's real. I think that's important. Or 20 years ago. And then there's can we find that thing in our own lives? Can we find the root of our belief in our own lives? Do we even know what that is? Do we even conceptualize that? And I think for a long time, especially in America, people did. And I don't know exactly when we went off that track, but we did. And the internet made it worse, and the internet did exactly what you were talking about there. But in some ways, it was the symptom of a larger thing, of an unrootedness. And the way I'm thinking about it now
Yeah, I
is
agree.
that We had a sapling. We threw it on the concrete, and there's no way it was going to grow roots in the concrete. Like you said, it was just rejected, and we've put the sapling back into soil now, and it could grow roots, or it could not. And decisions just matter. Decisions, both, quite frankly, like what we're doing, but also what the admin does, what the rest of tech does. All of those decisions matter, and those decisions decide whether we grow roots or we are just still drifting, still wandering around in the desert. How do you think that'll go?
I hope that you're right, that we're even rooted in soil right now. I think things feel optimistic and exciting. I feel like America's open for business is the vibe. And you see it really in strong distinction with what we're getting out of Europe. A lot of the optimism that I feel is helped by this constant reminder of how bad things are over there, especially in the UK. You're like, wow, that is just like the bizarre world version of America, where we made all the wrong decisions. Is you end up in a world where you're being arrested for saying bad things about the wrong protected group of people, while the rape gang offenders are getting off with a slap on the wrist. Let alone they're not building anything. There are no important companies in Europe, right? Like none that are relevant. When you look at all of the economic output, it's just pathetic in comparison to America and China. And it could be that bad. I don't know. It's not. It's nice to remind myself sometimes. At least you're not European. Love Europe. Actually, there are things like I love being in France. I love being in London. I love being in the south of Europe. Like these are beautiful places. I wish that they would love themselves and enough to protect themselves, but I don't think they will. But again, we just saw what felt like in 2020, it felt like we were watching the permanent ascension of a very terrifying leftist authoritarianism. And it doesn't seem to matter right now. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe that's actually more permanent than it seems. How many of the judges are still in place? You still can't get anything done because of all the justices in California that are of that old world mindset. Like, what will happen to all of the city of Los Angeles? Will any of these people be able to build again? How permanently fucked are these places that are still pretty blue? I don't know. Like, how much of the cultural shift that we feel is just us? It's a product of us being online too much or something. I think time will tell. I'm optimistic, but to answer your question, what do I think? How do I think it will go? I don't know. I don't know how it's going to go. I just have a hope that it goes well, and I would say a commitment to doing my part to make it go well.
I think this feeds really well into a whole chapter of questions about what happens next. There's this vibe shift, there's this chance, hopefully in my view, there's this chance to really grow roots, but like I said, that requires the right decisions. What's going to happen with Trump? Do you think that he is going to create new heroes, create new roots? What's going to happen?
I think Trump is going to surprise a lot of people by his pragmatism, and he's going to be focused mostly on his legacy. I think Trump is motivated by a desire to be remembered as the greatest president of all time. And that is a really kind of egotistical goal, but I don't care. I'm like, if he actually
Seems like
is,
a pretty good goal.
it's a great goal. It's a great goal for us. We have alignment. We all want the same. We all want him to be the greatest president. We should. I don't know. We certainly don't all, but I think most of us are in agreement that it would be fantastic for America if we have in Trump the greatest president of all time. If he actually does just, I don't know, reignite a sense of American self love, if he resecures the border and resecures our national security, if the economy is booming, if people can physically build again, if the regulators are dismantled and people are able to create, if businesses are flourishing, and all this, the just disgusting pyramid scheme of student debt is dismantled. If he does all of these things, we have Greenland and the Panama Canal is
We take
resecured.
Canada
And
and
now
Panama and
the fun in
Greenland and the
Texas,
moon.
are on the Gulf of America. That sounds fucking beautiful. And I think that he is on the path to working towards those things. I think he will be more successful than his first term because he has much more buy-in. First of all, culturally, it's night and day. He met massive resistance across the entire media landscape in 2016 in a way that he still is meeting, but no longer matters because the mainstream media is really much weaker, right? It's a piece of the puzzle. People are just they're not exclusively plugged into that world anymore. He has some support culturally that he didn't have previously. You saw that actually leading up to the election with both candidates pursuing podcasts and things like this. It was very interesting to see that. We've never seen it before, at least not to that extent. So he'll have this support. I think he also has a lot more institutional support in Washington from the right wing because there's been a huge psychological shift over the last 8 years towards him, especially after he was shot and won again against two different presidential Democrats, not one, but two, Biden and Kamala, he defeated. That's really, it was a remarkable victory of a kind that you can't ignore. And so he just has tons of support. He has support in Washington. He has cultural support. He has support among all of the major American industrialists, not only because, oh no, I better kiss the ring with Trump. That's what people keep saying. They keep framing it as like Mark
But it's
Zuckerberg.
not just that.
He's just scared of Trump. He's not scared of Trump. I think, first of all, I happen to believe that he believes these things, but whatever. That doesn't matter. What matters is that he and every other American business that operates anywhere else in the world is worried about what the rest of the world is doing to our companies. And Trump is of a kind of political philosophy, his own, Trumpianism, Trumpism, whatever it is a little bit like vaguely mercantilist. And he is very much interested. He believes that our companies flourishing both at home and abroad is in the best interest of our country. And therefore, they should be protected. And he will do things to protect them. And so he has not only support of the people, support in Washington, but support from our major companies. It's not a universal support. There's all sorts of things he has no support from whatsoever. For example, obviously the mainstream media, obviously Hollywood, obviously academia, but he has more than any Republican president that I can think of. I've never experienced. I don't think it's ever been like this for any Republican, let alone a Republican like Trump. So it will be. I think he'll do more, and it will be. I think he'll do more than we think, and I think that it will go well until it blows up. And that's not a really good prediction. It's pretty vague, but I think it'll be better than the first term.
So one of those things that I think Trump's legacy will be evaluated on is undoing the censorship state. And I think we see real attempts to do this. We see Kash Patel at FBI. We see Marco Rubio, Secretary of State. We see RFK Jr. at HHS. And at least all of the words are pointing in the right direction. Peter Thiel has this new op-ed in the FT that we mentioned where he's talking about inquiries into lab leak and whether we're still funding any more biosecurity programs and so on. Something that we couldn't talk about in 2020. Will Trump succeed in uprooting the people remember 2020 he was still in office. Will Trump succeed in uprooting the people who are in the CDC, in state, in FBI who are pushing censorship of people who supported him?
Sorry, I was writing myself a note as you mentioned the Peter thing. Can you just rephrase that question one more time?
Yes. In 2020, we had a lot of social media censorship of people who supported Trump. A lot of that came from within his own administration. It came from the CDC, it came from the FBI, it came from the State Department. And Trump is now pointing at appointees to take that on. Do you think he'll succeed?
There's no way to tell. I don't like this sort of pantheon of questions. I'm not going to be good at. I don't believe in them almost. I don't think you can ever predict these things. I prefer to focus on what's happening actually and right now, and then what maybe that indicates and or what that could make potentially possible or what makes possible. I do believe the question of whether or not he can succeed, it's a massive problem. That's crazy. I don't know how. It's like Frodo and the One Ring walking off to Mordor, right? Trying to destroy the Ring of Power. It seems not possible. However, we've also never seen so many people empowered in a way they have been by Trump to handle this problem. And so many people who I personally trust and believe in the motivation of, who don't seem, Republicans never were like, they were like, think about the Bush era Republicans, they were also just bureaucrats. They were all these just they all were this. The Republicans and the Democrats felt like exactly the same thing. They were the same thing. They were all statists who just believed in in different degrees of the same overall bureaucratic game.
Yeah, the
And
thing I've heard is that Republicans are just Democrats driving the speed limit.
so this feels much different than that. And now there's a lot of support around not only Trump, but his nominees. I don't know if it will succeed. I do believe in the motivation that these people want it to succeed. They want to make these things impossible in the future. They want to pull the curtain back and show us all what had been going on and to fix some of the stuff that led to the disasters that we saw throughout the COVID era. I think that we are in the best position ever to do it, and I'm hopeful that they will make some progress.
Yeah, same here. Maybe this is a question that has a more concrete answer. We talked about building those routes. What are you going to do at Pirate Wires? How are you? What's the 2025? What's Project 2025 for Pirate Wires?
Yeah, I don't want to give away too many of my secrets,
Give away the secrets.
but I think overall the plan is to dominate within tech culture, tech government, like those kind of spaces, and then like our kind of overall analysis and opinion, like that like voice. Once we dominate in that world of tech, expand. But right this moment, I'm still very much on a domination path. We have to dominate where we are and just really own that whole lane. And then once we have that, it's clear sailing.
Yeah, someone who I talked to. So Aaron Siberium, one of the top conservative or right of center journalists, he says that the right is just really bad at breaking stories. That there are stories
Yeah.
there that you just need to go talk to people. You just need to get sourcing. You just need to care about the facts. Don't maybe you can have a little bit of a slant. Maybe that's inevitable, but just don't go overboard with it. And that the right just does not do that well. And that there's just
Well,
really an
that's yes.
undersupply of that.
Yeah, that's the information ecosystem is the foundation is new. It's who updated the canon. It is where who just delivered a new fact. This funding bill was paused because of X, Y, and Z action in Congress. This hotel in Las Vegas is now run by a migrant gang from Venezuela. Like this storm is on the path for this city, right? Like these are these like the basic facts that are reported, and those are almost entirely monopolized. The canon, the first like the foundational building block of the discourse, almost entirely monopolized still by the mainstream press, places like the New York Times. And then all the other smaller ones are doing different pieces of that. I just saw one yesterday, which was really interesting. A scoop, a tech press scoop, it was called. Basically, Sam Biddle just cherry picked a handful of the worst possible things you would be able to say under the new Facebook regime, censorship regime, anti-censorship regime. And that became a scoop. And now that is the first building block on what happens at Meta. It's not oriented towards what are all of the political opinions that are totally in bounds that we're not allowed to say. It's what is the most extreme thing that you don't like personally that you're going to have a hard time stomaching that you're now allowed to say. That then frames the entire, so that very foundational building block of the discourse now frames the entire next wave of discourse. That's like analysis, opinion pieces, tweets, all of that stuff ends up on the news. And then you see it at night. Your parents are texting you about what they read or saw on CNN or Fox News or something like that. All of that comes from that second wave. So that's a third wave. And then fourth wave is culture. It's reaction to that. It's movies and books and politicians who are running on things that are now created by popular sentiment. So it's really important to be contributing to what matters, which is that first layer. And yeah, Aaron does a good job of it.
Yeah, the base layer zero Why hasn't the right been good at that? And
That's not
Pirate Wires here to save the day?
the right is not really good at anything cultural at all. I think who knows why? It's better to just acknowledge that it's true and move on. And so I think there's a real like disrespect. Probably the hatred of media has not helped. The hatred of media has led to a real disrespect for the work of media, which is really good. And, or at least not good, let's say powerful, influential, important. If you really hate it and you spend your time making fun of these people all the time, then you've lowered the status associated with roles in that profession. And so naturally, people right of center are not going to want to do that. And then it's just, there's not so much money to be made in media.
But you want
And
to do that.
I want to do what?
Break stories.
We do break stories. We don't. Yeah, we break stories. That's not like the number one thing that we do, but we break stories, and we want to break more stories. We've broken a bunch of stories over the last year, and I am, yeah, very excited to be doing more of that.
Yeah, your story on Gemini with the Google insiders, that was fantastic.
Thank
And
you.
there's so much that needs to be done. Let me phrase my last question better. Like, how are you thinking about learning those lessons from the perspective of pirate, either for incoming? Let's take the scenario. You have a new editor or a new staff writer at Pirate Wires who's focused on breaking stories. What are you going to tell them?
I don't think that I would. They don't. No one comes on and says, let's focus on breaking stories. It's more if you're interested in a topic. We get submissions all the time that are. I had one about heroes today. Someone was like, "Oh, I want to write about how I have this story, this piece. It's all about how we don't like heroes anymore, and we need more. Excuse me, and we need more
Many
heroes
people are saying,
in society." And I said, "Well, we don't. That's not what we really. I don't accept things like that from as a submission, really, at Pirate Wires. What I want, piece, if you can update the canon in some way, if you have novel information, if you are responding immediately to a story, there are a couple of kinds of things. One would be the most important that I really want is new information that's in a story that we're able to tell ourselves. But then it would be analysis based on, so you could, I'd be interested maybe in a piece that was talking about what was happening in the, let's say when the Daniel Penny thing was happening. It would be interesting to do a piece on Daniel Penny and then a broader point about heroes. So you could then you have to earn your right to just give an opinion on something, I think. And that may be the second class of thing that I would accept from a contributor. But I would tell my writers in house, just focus on, go after your beats, things that you're really excited about. Don't just write about them. Go find people who are working in them and ask them questions and find out what they're doing. And you'll scoops this like the scoops will come. If you're writing about stuff that you love that is not out there yet, it'll just happen.
on the one hand,
Conservative.
uh,
Let me talk about right wing stuff for a second, really quick.
go
The,
ahead.
the what was happening? Why don't right wing people create scoops or whatever? They were not even creating real media companies. It was much more what was happening was there were right wing bloggers and opinion people who were just reacting to what they were seeing from the media. Like they were receiving information and then rejecting the analysis surrounding that information. And so that was an opinion on it. That was opinions versus opinions. There was no real dedication to the project of acquiring and disseminating new information. And I think that we're just seeing more of that now, not just right or left. I'm saying like across the ideological spectrum, people are just bringing new information to the internet. I think it's almost just an emergent. I think we're going to see more and more of it. And you're going to have more and more of a situation where the New York Times is going to have, there was a huge, was the Daily, went on and on about the fires and global warming and all this shit. No mention of the fire hydrants, no mention of the land management, no mention of the insurance problem that was caused by the policies in California. All this stuff that was spreading like wildfire on X and across Instagram and TikTok, none of that was in the Times. They had to actually, and I know they saw it, they had to actually ignore it. And I think that now that they are not monopolizing the entire discourse, they're going to have to make decisions all the time about, okay, do I address what everybody's talking about or do I not? And that's because new information is coming to those places more and more. And that's going to keep happening.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say about the Google Gemini story, is that it was just known that Google was leaky as hell. That was just the case. And still, conservative media just did not pick up on it, did not go and just, I don't know, like we know Google engineers, but even if you're some like conservative journalist who's never worked in tech, like just DM people, just go on, find people on Twitter whose accounts say machine learning at Google or something like that. I know so few people who just try, who just do the bare minimum. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen very often. And it's frustrating to me. That's the ground zero, layer zero first thing that I would advise people to do. And to me, it just doesn't happen enough. And I try to do this a little bit to pass people on to the right people, but I just want more of it. There could be so much more. It is just a tiny fraction of what it could be.
I think that I talked to people on that Google piece who were really reluctant to speak to me because they felt just immoral about it. And that's maybe the difference too. Just like my perspective on the world is more aligned with people who are super loyal to their company and don't want to betray any information. And I think that the kind of reporting you hear a lot of, so I saw a piece from the New York Times on the culture of Facebook following Mark Zuckerberg's decisions at Meta and to change the get rid of the fact checkers and embrace a policy of free speech. And it was super biased, obviously, but not, I think, on purpose. It was biased by the kinds of people who were willing to talk to a journalist from the New York Times. They are obviously left wing and they obviously have a different perspective on what's going on than, I don't know, anyone who cares about free speech because they've been suppressing it for years. Do I believe that really there was widespread outrage over Zuckerberg's decision at Meta? I don't actually believe that. I think there was some outrage among very crazy people who have been super marginalized over the past 5 years and don't matter. But those were the people who were willing to talk, and they talked to the New York Times. I have tried to get people to talk on that one, for example. I don't have many people who I know at Facebook. Would love to talk to you. Actually asked to find some and didn't have any bites. Nobody reached out. I think it's if you want a different kind of me. I was just talking to someone in the administration, the new administration, about a topic that I don't want to bring up just yet. But he was saying X, Y, and Z is real or whatever. And I'm like, great. When you're ready, would love information that I could report about it first. And it's, oh yeah, thumbs up for sure. And I'm like, no, seriously though, you have to fucking feed me. Give me the information. Tell me the new things that are happening so I can write about them because your choice, right? These people complain relentlessly about the press that exists. Okay, I get it. I hate them too. But if you want a new kind of media, then you have to feed the media that you like. So bring me the stories and I will report the stories.
Yeah, that's a lesson. I think Aaron said that people have been saying variants of this, but this time it all comes down to the same thing over and over again, is just hoping this time it will be different. And there are some signs that it actually might.
Yeah, I feel good. We're getting there.
What did you mean by the healthcare problems were created by politicians on purpose?
I just think that if you want a socialized Medicare, like a socialized medicine scheme, you want a one payer system, you want to force everybody into this very on paper simple scheme where you get rid of all of the insurance and have control of all of the pricing and all the drugs and everything else. What you would want to do is make the current system as intractable and painful as you possibly and just inscrutable, impossible to understand as you possibly could. And you would do it over time, piece by piece, and it would get more and more cumbersome until everyone, and right now I think we're there. 20 years ago, defend people on the right, usually Republicans, would defend our healthcare system. They would say, no, the left is wrong. We have the best healthcare system in the world, and here are all the reasons. No one agrees with that anymore. Everyone is, I don't give a fuck what's happening in the rest of the world. Our healthcare system is a nightmare. It is a convoluted mess. and I hate it. And I hate the people working in it. And I hate the people who did this to me. And I'm looking for a scapegoat now. And that's the success of Luigi Mangione as an idea, sort of form haunting the internet hellscape right now. And that is the kind of thing that leads inevitably to someone saying, listen, we need to just burn this whole system down and start over, and having a lot of support to do that. And then what is the system that you put in place? You're not going to have total.
Communist revolution. Yeah.
That's the only one that you can possibly do. And I think that is why this has become so convoluted.
Yeah. The story always becomes like the current system, which they call capitalism, versus socialized medicine. And the premise is just wrong because it is just not. It is not. If one pole is socialized medicine and the other pole is capitalist medicine, we are so much closer to the socialist pole than the capitalist pole.
Yeah.
It is just so overregulated. And you saw this is jumping a little bit further now, but you saw this with the fire insurance in California and the LA fires, their tragedy. It was not made any better by California like banning correct insurance increases based on the risk of the fire.
Exactly.
And they de facto banned this. I know you've been looking for some of this.
Yeah, and I've been talking
Um,
about it. I just saw a tweet of Jason Calacanis's this morning that was just, oh, it's so terrible. I can't believe that this happened with the insurance. And it's just, yeah, that is really terrible. But when you tweet something like that or post something like that, it's really reckless to not actually to include the actual reason for that. It is not this situation where a bunch of mean fire insurers were saying, "Oh my God, let's just fuck a bunch of Californians and revoke their insurance." It was the situation where the California government said you are not allowed to increase rates. It doesn't matter that you think the risk is increased, which also concurrently every politician in California is saying. It doesn't matter that you think the risk is increased. It doesn't matter that the current rates that you're offering are untenable and will lead to your own disaster as a company. You will definitely long-term fail if the
yes,
risks
it's just
are
suicide.
so they did that, and the insurers did the only thing they could possibly do to exist, which is no longer offer insurance that is too cheap for them to stay in business. And now people are blaming the insurers. That's the next stage of this discourse. And it's okay, this is not even a hard one. This is not even like healthcare insurance, which is complicated endlessly by a million different things. This is very simple. Policy exists in the 1980s, is created. Policy is abused by politicians over the last 5 years. Policy is abused by politicians in that region that's affected like 6 months ago. Fire happens, people don't have insurance. The policy is the problem. And we can just point directly to it. And so if you have a problem with what's happening right now, you don't need to say fire insurance. You need to say this politician did this thing. Who is it? Here is their name. Here is their fucking wherever. What is it? What is it called? Here's their district. Here are the people who voted for them. Here's this person who's running against them who will replace them and change their policy. That is the approach. That has the only approach that should be happening right now. Anything else is just a grift for attention. And it really bothers me, especially on this one, because emotions are running extremely high right now. And so it's very easy to demonize almost anybody for any reason. You're going to see a lot of witch burnings happening over the next few days. And I agree there are some witches that need to be burned, but they're all politicians. So we should focus our ire at them.
Yeah, we both know people who like had to evacuate. Um, I'm sure many of the same people. It is a tragedy. And what's tricky is that it feels like we've ended up in a trap where the villains always get away with it, and sometimes innocent people are scapegoated. But it's always mismatched. If you think of, and this is obviously oversimplified, but if you think of a sliding scale of anger, the innocent people who get targeted and scapegoated are at a much lower level of anger than like the people actually responsible. And to actually get the people responsible is just so much harder and risks so much like completely unnecessary and misplaced anger.
Yeah, I think because the people responsible are inherently polarized because they're all politicians. So they all come with, a letter next to their name. It's a D or an R. And that makes it impossible for a certain kind of person, who happens to be most people, unfortunately, to think clearly about their policies and the impact of their policies. So that's always going to happen. There's always going to be a scapegoat. And that's maybe a human impulse to, separately from all this American politicization and culture warring, that is very deep and very ancient, and maybe there's no fix for it at all. But that's certainly what's happening right now, is we're looking at scapegoats in every direction.
Yeah, the philosopher Rene Girard, who is a great influence on Peter Thiel, um, he always said that the scapegoat may be guilty of something, but he's never guilty of the thing that he is accused of.
Yeah.
People always exaggerate. People always create myths of people who they sacrificed. That was the kind of Girardian thesis. How much do you think about Girard on the day to day?
Never. Only when he obviously came up a lot working with Peter, and it has come up a lot working with Peter, but much more so also years ago when I was working on the class with him that led to his book 0 to 1. That's when I heard about. That's when I was really like steeped in Girard. Read a bunch of it, and that was a long time ago though for me. That was 13 years ago, I think, at this point. And then yeah, it comes up again here and there. But I'm aware of it. I know roughly the thinking. Um, I think it's unmistakably a play all throughout the media landscape. Yeah,
So, what's the play?
a play. It's unmistakably afoot. I see it everywhere. That's what fuels like most media feuding and most social media feuding, probably most political feuding. It's all just people who want the same shit.
Oh, I see. Like the mimesis and the rivalry. That's what fuels the media.
And then you think you actually you want what someone else has, and then you trick yourself into thinking that you had it first and stuff like this.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And you get these cycles of it where everyone is jumping on the same scapegoat, and these things that start out as really only mattering to a few people, they just snowball and keep growing and growing until they're the current thing. And everyone's thinking about them. Everyone's talking about them, at least in the media ecosystem. Is that a problem? Or are we caring too much about everything that becomes the current thing?
I am probably I think probably right now we are. I think nobody cared about it enough leading up to the late 20 teens. The current thing mattered a lot. You had to battle it actually, and people didn't, especially in tech. People were very much of the belief that they could just focus on their one cool little project. And if they just built it and made the world better, nothing else would matter. That was not true. The politics would come for you eventually if you didn't engage with them. But now I think we could use a lot more of people working on their own weird little thing and not caring what other people think and not caring what other people are saying and what the current thing is, but really just digging down deep into their weird shit and watering it. I think probably is not now is probably the time for that.
Oh, I realized I didn't ask this beforehand. How much do you want to talk about building Hereticon?
Not really. It's over. It's not going to happen again for 2 years. I can talk about it a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, if it's not really the mood, I'll cut this all out. But yeah, that's fine. We don't have to talk about everything. Is there like a interesting story that you want to tell at all about Hereticon?
I think the interesting thing about Hereticon, at least to me, even leading into this one, but certainly when I think about what the next one is going to look like in a couple years, I had the idea for Hereticon in 2018 or so. I actually released a piece about the idea in 2019, and the first Hereticon was supposed to happen in 2020. early 2020. Not that early. I think it was like March of 2020. So at that time, it became a meme pretty fast and then was very quickly and very unfairly maligned and attacked. And I was personally attacked, called like a Nazi and things like this by race baiting psychopaths like a Neil Dash. I think is his name. Neil Dash. Yeah. Used to be
And this was 2019.
this was 2019. And
Oh, yeah, yeah.
at that time there were so many ideas that were very interesting that you couldn't talk about that felt really important that I was very excited to platform and just give people space to talk about. And people like Anil, for example, are they're just so stupid and short-sighted and I think ignorant that they didn't know any of that or think of any of that or have any of those ideas that they wanted to share and couldn't. And the only thing they could think of that could possibly be forbidden is Nazism because that was how their mind was wired because they were plugged into this, I don't know, crazy leftist hellscape version of the internet that used to exist and had no friends outside of that with any kind of interesting ideas. But that
Which
wasn't
you
the
can
case.
still see if you log on to bluesky.com.
Now they're all there and it's like they're quarantined, thank God. And they can just stay there and yell at each other. But so in 2019, it was really easy for me. There were so many cool things worth talking about, from like weird biohacking stuff, this kind of stuff that like Brian Johnson is doing now, for example, all the longevity stuff, very controversial back then. Now it's still controversial to some people, but not to most. Back then, it felt very controversial. AI felt really controversial. Brain chip type stuff felt controversial. UFO discourse, very controversial back
Yeah,
then
yeah.
in a very interesting way. It was like very like hard and edgy to talk about. There's all sorts of cultural stuff, sex work, things like this that I wanted to talk about. There were a lot of ideas. And that by 20, so we don't end up doing it until 2021. That's when we're able to do it because of COVID. Actually, and back in 20, we also, Peter was going to give a talk on the apocalypse. He was going to talk about the fact that we were in danger of one, which felt very controversial back then. Nobody believed that. It felt like very strange kind of idea. He was going to talk about things like I have the original talk that he was going to give. He was going to mention it was like nuclear holocaust risk, AI risk, pandemic risk. All of those things became, some of them more obviously than others, but they all became very mainstream over the next few years. And so by 2021, when we hosted it, it was really fun and still felt insightful and exciting, but it was already getting to a place where I was like, I see a lot of people now online doing this woke whack-a-mole thing where they're like, we need to be talking about, oh, don't stop me from saying what I believe. Don't stop me from saying the truth or whatever. That had already become a kind of part of our culture, which already means that to give a really good Hereticon is it's getting more and more difficult to give one that is both controversial in a fun way and also helpful. So when I did it again in 2024, the summer of 2024, or no, the fall of 2024, that was even more difficult. There were a lot of people now who were, you had seen the rise of a kind of heterodox platform where there were all these sort of air quote controversial ideas that someone who didn't believe the experts would have. And they ranged from stuff about COVID to stuff about vaccines generally, to UFOs, to the trans conversation and stuff like this. And it just felt boring to me. And so I was really reaching to find interesting topics or topic spaces that were controversial or inhibited in some way, but also worth talking about. And so I think that's becoming more and more difficult, which is a really good sign. And it's healthy for culture that it's easier right now to talk about things that are a little bit out of the mainstream. In fact, the question of what is the mainstream right now is not something that I have an answer to, which it makes it very hard to throw a conference that is conceptually the mainstream. That's the whole point of it, is to be is to be not a reaction to, but like an answer to the mainstream. Is to be this subversive, fun other place beyond the mainstream. Okay, what is the mainstream? I need a really good sense of that for me to do really any of my work, and that's becoming very difficult to do.
Yeah, there are elements of this that I think are really insightful. I definitely see the heterodox Twitter accounts that you're talking about that are, that are doing that shtick. I worry that we're in a phase of false security. And I was actually really optimistic after reading Peter Thiel's op ed. This is something that changed my mind on it. But I really do worry that we're in a false sense of security where there are still things that can't be talked about, but there's so much theater around, oh, we can't talk about this thing, but actually we can. We're talking about it right now. That the real taboo becomes obscured. Carl Schmitt has this line that's the most powerful law is the invisible law. It's the law that you're not even litigating a court case. It just rules everything. Um, I think Peter understands this. I think he understands this better than almost anyone. He says in this op ed, let me read from this. Speaking of Fauci and his advisor, did they suspect that COVID spawned from US taxpayer funded research or an adjacent Chinese military program? Why did we fund the work of EcoHealth Alliance, which sent researchers into remote Chinese caves to extract novel coronaviruses? Is gain of function research a byword for a bioweapons program? And how did our government stop the spread of such questions on social media? I think I think it's very important to read this passage closely. I think it's really important to read the entire op-ed closely. I think one should borrow from the work of Leo Strauss, who wrote of esoteric writing. And I think that people should be clear-eyed about COVID and that we're really at a risk of people chasing the shiny thing, the thing that used to be heterodox and is no longer heterodox, and being lured into a false sense of security. And I see I don't think it's just COVID. I see this happening with a lot of issues.
Yeah, I don't have anything to say to that other than I do agree with it. And Peter would agree with it, I think. A big theme of his on the apocalypse stuff is very much it's when you don't think that you're at risk at all that you're at the greatest risk of all. And it's why he wanted to talk about the apocalypse stuff so much in 2019. And it is the substance of a lot of what he talked about this last time around. It's the thing that we're not thinking about, right? It's the false sense of security. That's the real danger.
Yeah, and this gets to some of the globalization stuff. A lot of it is not just the ideal. This is actually a critique that I think Gerard had. The ideal of specialization, the kind of Adam Smith economic theory of specialization and of globalization, is that we get global trade and everyone is working on their own little area, their own like little specialty in technology, and we do get some of that. We do get some specialization. China does more heavy industry, the US does more software and a few other things, but you also get this kind of homogenization of values, right? You get everyone wanting the same thing. This is the problem Gerard worried about. You get more worryingly people trying to enforce the same thing, have the same regulations. This is really the most apocalyptic thing about the EU trying to force not just their own countries, not just members of the EU, but the entire world. This is, I think Peter Thiel would call this an element of the Antichrist. Yeah, this element of a kind of global culture, this is very worrying to me. And I think very worrying to a lot of people.
I don't understand the global, what is the question surround in the global culture piece?
Yeah, I guess one way to think of it is as a criticism of libertarianism, that you had this traditional understanding of trade that would lead to all this specialization, that would lead to people pursuing different things. And to be clear, that has at least in part happened. But the criticism of it would be that pales in comparison to this cultural effect. It pales in comparison to everyone thinking the same thing, wanting the same thing, talking about the same thing. And actually, that the risk there's these two things. There's the benefit of being able to trade and being able to work on different things, and there's the risk that even given that option, that people will choose to pursue the same thing. And the big question is that in fact what has happened? Is what has happened over the last like 40 years of globalization Has it been everyone wanting the same thing, or has it been people specializing and pursuing different things? And what's the, dominant effect?
I don't know. I think to go back earlier on what I was saying around the Hereticon stuff is it's become strangely for all of our openness as a society and for the existence of social media, which is supposed to be this portal into what everyone is thinking and doing. I feel less of a sense of what's really truly our culture right now than I did even a few years ago. I think, in fact, in my work at Pirate Wires, a lot of what I'm doing is trying to figure it out. I'll parse a question a bunch of different ways and ask a bunch of different questions to the question, almost like you'll see it in my writing. It's like part of my style. It's just a lot of questions. And most of those are questions that I have myself. And then I try and figure them out. I don't, yeah, I just don't know. I don't know the answer to your question. I think it's an open question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it definitely is an open question. People are talking about this probably in rules that are consequential to US trade policy as we speak. I don't know anything specific about that. I just think it's likely.
I think our trade policy is just going to be nationally interested. It will be whatever is in our interest, it'll be what is done. And Trump will make a lot of really crazy claims, but he's going to do that. That's just a bargaining strategy. So that's just what's going to happen.
Yeah, there was this report out recently that his plan for global tariffs is not actually global tariffs on everything. And there was some controversy because the journalist framed it as Trump walks back global tariff policy.
The
And
entire
his
conversation,
office actually complained about that, said that was like a deceptive framing or so on. Sorry, go ahead.
I just think that the entire conversation always about, oh, Trump's proposed policy is going to tank the economy or whatever, it's always just so silly to me because he doesn't want to do that. All he cares about is the economy pumping. So that's what he's going to do. It's very different than when, let's say, Bernie Sanders proposes something and a bunch of people say, wait a minute, if he actually did that, it seems pretty bad for the economy. And the reason that it's different is because Bernie Sanders does not care about the economy doing well as much as he cares about everybody having the same things. There's an ideological difference there. Trump is pragmatic and Bernie Sanders is highly ideological, as is someone like Rand Paul, for example. These are highly, especially Ron Paul, highly ideological people. So there is always a question of second order consequences. When you talk to a libertarian, for example, about something like their border policy or even gun control, the idea that like there wouldn't be less, obviously there would be less shootings if there were no guns. Like we know that. The question is not will there'll be less shootings if it's way harder, or less suicides that happen if people can't get access to a handgun, at least less suicide by handgun. It's more, do you think that loss in life is worth it for freedom? That's the question that's really being asked. And I wish that ideological, like libertarians would be more honest about that and just say what they really think, which is yes, they don't care about the fact. They do care, of course, they care about the shootings and things like this. But they don't care about it as much as the idea that they're not going to be able to have guns. And that's perfectly acceptable, in my opinion. It's fine to have that position, but that's what's happening there. And Trump is not that kind of person. I don't see him as an ideological person at all. I see him as just like extremely pragmatic, and all he wants is for things in America to go well. And so if things start going not well, he will tinker around until they do. He will open things up, he will drop the tariffs, whatever he has to do, he will do. And so I just like none of this really matters. And I just read what he's saying always through the lens of he loves to bargain with other people. He loves to bargain with other countries. He has a long history of bargaining on the trade issue. He did it all throughout his first term. And guess what? The economy was fucking ripping before they released a bioweapon and took out the entire global economy. So I'm fine. I'm looking forward to it, in fact. And we'll see in a few years.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to agree with and a lot to disagree with. Well, really, just one thing to disagree with. I agree with you about Trump being a pragmatic person, about wanting the economy to do well. I agree with you that in his first, at least in his first 3 years, let's say, the economy was great. And even after COVID, some aspects of the economy remained great. But I also think there's room for mistakes. I think that there are plenty of people who are well intentioned, even just thinking from the perspective of a CEO or a founder. There are founders who want the best for their company, have their entire life savings invested in their company and their company's stock, and can make mistakes and can make irreversible mistakes. And I think that, especially if less so with things that he can reverse right away with executive order, but if he's passing legislation, I think there's room for mistakes. Once again, I think that his record is good. I think that his heart is in the right place. I think that he's pragmatic. I agree with all of these things, but I do think that there's a level of playing with fire that at least you should pay attention about. I'm not saying that it's guaranteed to go poorly, but that it's like the Peter Thiel thing. The problems that will be most devastating are the ones that you won't expect.
Yeah, that's true. And I think Trump will make a lot of mistakes. He's a human. It's just, I don't really judge him on much more than what I believe to be his goals. And we are goal aligned. And that is so much more than I felt for Kamala Harris, whose goals are mysterious. That's crazy to have a person running for president who had mysterious goals. It's not for me. I at least know what Trump wants. I'm happy about that. I think it seems roughly fine, and we'll see how it goes. I'm not in super alignment with some of his most hardcore friends online, but they're not in the White House, so we'll see.
You mentioned biotech. I'm very interested in where biotech will go and whether that'll be a schism on the right. Maybe that's more of the speculation genre of question. Do you want to talk about that?
I think the cultural part is interesting because what you're hinting at is this a division that we see again and again as tech becomes more right wing, it crashes against a certain kind of traditional type conservative. Biotech, just on the tech side of things, the business side of things, biotech has been exciting to me for a long time. I've been for as long as I've been working at Founders Fund, I've been talking about things like space colonization, artificial intelligence, and bio. And bio is the one that hasn't worked the way that the fantasy utopian vision of it seemed it was going to work. And yet there are still all sorts of incredible projects happening there. And Founders Fund, we're super agnostic, so Founders Fund will look at anything. But it certainly feels like I'm seeing less of the crazy sci-fi-esque kind of things. Those things do exist, but we haven't really seen them. I think it's a big question of what's going to work. It just takes people a long time to figure out what to do with it. And the weird questions will happen. So, for example, I think we mapped the human genome in, was it like the early 2000s? Yeah, it was early 2000s. Its project begins in 1990. Human genome is mapped in 2003.
And
Everybody,
what came of that?
I'm not as much as people thought. People
Yeah.
at the time, people thought that was like, we've cracked the codes, the building blocks of our body. That's the end. We'll be able to do anything. Disease is over. Cancer is over. Like, regeneration is here. Like, we're going to be able to do anything. And then it's just, biology is really hard and complicated and messy. It's not as people like to think of biology like programming. You have those like four essential building blocks. And so people talk about that in DNA sequencing and things like this as comparable to programming. And I think it's just not like that. Maybe it's like similar to that, but I think that what we tend to do as a people is whatever the most dominant technology is at that time, we tend to see that in everything. We tend to, right now we're doing it with
Yeah, we
machine.
mythologize it.
Yes, and we say that it's universal. Everything that's happening with AI right now, it's very common for people in tech to refer to the human brain as like an LLM. It's just not. And it's just weird. The brain is weird. Biology is very weird. And I think very hard and very exciting. And probably a lot of cool stuff will happen. And as those cool things happen, we will see a divide on the right. And you see it already in the divide between Brian Johnson and the health influencers on the right. Like these sort of the most metrics man alive versus the sun your balls, just eat a bunch of red meat and walk around in the sunshine, neutral right wing. You see it in the anti surrogacy crowd. So like the idea that we want to build artificial wombs and do genetic engineering on our children, and that's all said to we're going to eliminate disease. And what if we amplified intelligence and created super babies, and all that stuff is very popular on the tech right. Certainly a topic of interest. It's maybe a little bit like ooh spooky but exciting. And on the trad right, it's seen as like the work of Satan. All of those things are super duper. Those are things that are in conflict now. And in terms of just like the culture question, those are things that will continue to be in conflict over the next 4 years, and I think will really escalate. As it's very interesting to see people just obsessed right now with the question of the declining birth rates on the right, and then when you talk about surrogacy and things like that, it's oh my no, shut it down. This is the abuse of women and all of this stuff. It's like you're we could never do this. Okay, then what I think that you really care about is not the birth rate. I think that what you really care about is like women in the workforce, which is an interesting question. Maybe you can go and talk about that, but that's really what they're mad about. What they really want is this fantasy of a man at work and a woman at home and a bunch of kids and a white picket fence. And that's actually, some people have that and it's beautiful. My sister has a version of that. I don't think they actually have a white picket fence, but she's generally home and her husband is at work and they have a couple of kids who are fucking amazing. Their family's brilliant and I love it for them. And I think that's a really great lifestyle. And I think a lot of people would find a lot of meaning there. And it's a beautiful thing. But it's also not something that I'm interested in forcing people to do. And it is something that I constantly defend. It's interesting as someone who I find myself constantly defending that from stupid leftists who think it's some kind of like slavery. And now I'm increasingly getting it on the right, which is there's one way to have a family and one way to live in this world. And I think certainly there are things that are wrong, but the idea of like nuclear family, American style or whatever, I don't think there's ever been a time in American history where that was everybody. That was maybe the middle class. That was not the lower class. And that was not, maybe that was also the upper class. But it was not something that was, it was not on the frontier, right? It wasn't like women were just tucked away. Like they were fucking working. You're on a homestead. It's hard. Like everyone is involved. I don't know. This is a well off topic, but I think that you're going to see these arguments swirling around over the next couple of years. And I think surrogacy will come up. And that is where I think the right is, they don't really care about birth rates and progress, generally speaking. And tech, maybe right wing, but it is not conservative. It's progressive in the idea that everybody in tech believes in doing things to make the world a better place and to change it. So that's the inherent conflict.
A great preview of what's to come. Thank you for joining the podcast, Mike Solana, billionaire media tycoon and founder of Pirate Wires.
Subscribe or die. Thanks for having me.
Yes.